All right, so let's now use all our Flexbox knowledge in order to build the overall page layout using Flexbox. And actually, that shouldn't be too hard for us at this point, because the layout is actually quite simple. So let's now make this a bit bigger again. And so remember that the layout we are trying to achieve is simply this. So basically, the header and the footer are going to stay in place. So they are already perfect right now. And so all we need to do is to put this article side by side with the related posts. And these related posts, remember, should have a width of 300 pixels. And then we want a gap here in the middle of 75 pixels. Now, okay, so let's do that. And again, what we need to do is basically only put this element here side by side with this article. And so once again, the first question to ask is, what is going to be our flex container? So is it maybe the container element? So the element with the class of container? Well, let's go to the top of the page. Let's try that out. Display flex. And well, it doesn't look like that was the correct solution. So now everything here is kind of side by side, and that makes sense. So the reason for that is that all of these, so the header, the article, the aside, and the footer, all of them are actually children of this container. And so of course, this is not our flex container we are looking for. Instead, what we will have to do is to create a new one. So with Flexbox, many times it is necessary to create a new flex container in order to achieve our layouts. So remember in the last lecture, we actually had to do the same thing here for each related post. So we had to create a new div here so that this div could then be side by side with the image. So that's not the same situation actually, but we still had to create a new element in order to achieve our layout. So that's, again, quite common using Flexbox. But anyway, now we want to create a parent for both the article and the aside. So let's create a new div here. So again, an element without a real meaning. And this one, I'm going to call it just row. So a very generic name, which we could reuse all over the page if we wanted. So let's remove this one from here and paste it after the end of the aside. So here ends the article, then starts the aside, and then after the aside and before the footer is where we close the div, give it a save, and then it reformats everything. And so let's then go down here to the end of our code and start building the layout. So our row is now the flex container. And so this is what it looks like. And actually, that already looks pretty good, just like this. So without having to do a lot of work, actually. Now let's just inspect this aside, because it looks like it already has a width. But, well, actually it doesn't. So this is just a Flexbox automatic position, basically automatically trying to figure out the perfect width for this element. So apparently that's 281 pixels, but what we want it to be is 300 pixels. So just like we did before when we did it with floats, right? So let's specify the width of the aside. And now remember that for flex items, we should not use the width property, but instead use the flex basis. So that would be flex basis 300 pixels. Let's see if that works. And it doesn't seem to work, right? So it's still at 281. And the reason for that must be is that Flexbox like to automatically shrink these elements. So we need to set flex shrink to 0. Remember that. And we should actually do all of that in the shorthand flex property anyway. So just flex. And then the first one, remember, is flex grow. And let's check that out here. And actually, I will copy it here because this can be a source of confusion. Okay. So just formatting it here quickly to make it look a bit better. And so here the default of flex grow is 0, and we want to keep that. And the default of flex shrink is 1, but let's set that also to 0 to force it to be exactly 300 pixels wide. And so maybe you saw that it grew, and indeed now we have our 300 pixels. All right. And now let's actually format the article as well. So that's this other column basically. And for now, let's do it in a similar way. So setting these to 0 and then specifying exactly 825 pixels, just like we did before. So that's going to be 825 plus a 75 pixels of space between them, and then plus the 300 pixels right here. So let's do it like this for now, but we will change that a bit later. Okay. And now let's add that gap here in between. So that's space. And so for that, on the flex container, remember, we can use the gap property. So let's set that to 75 pixel, just like before. And so now our layout is basically done. Let's check that out. So 300 pixels, and this one has our 825 pixels. And so everything added together gives us our 1200 pixels, which is the width of the container. Now, having to do all this math kind of defeats the purpose of using Flexbox in the first place. And so maybe we just want the aside to be really this size, but then the article, maybe we can allow Flexbox to automatically figure out its size, right? So usually what we do in a situation like this is to simply set flex to 1, which will then automatically allow this element to grow as much as it can in the available space. And so if we give this a save, then our element should actually look exactly the same as before. And indeed, it does. So it's still 825 pixels wide because that is simply the space that is available for it. And so, well, that's then exactly the space that it can fill. Okay, now let's just figure out what happens down here. And maybe you have noticed that this aside here grew all the way to the bottom. So we will take a look at why that happens, but you also see that it actually grew a bit more. So almost here to the end. And the reason for that is that this article has some margin here, which we also added way back. And so one more time, this margin is kind of part of the size of this element. And so let's now actually remove that here. So margin bottom 0. Okay. And instead, to create some space here between the footer and this content, let's add that margin bottom to the entire row. So to this container, right? But what matters is that now this is at least kind of aligned to this one, right? So margin bottom of 60 pixels. Nice. And now let's think why actually this element grew all the way until the bottom here. So can you think why that is happening? Well, the reason is that remember how the default value for align items is stretch. So basically, if we don't define align items, then automatically all the elements will stretch as far as they can. And in this case, the largest element is this aside here, or actually this article, which we can see if we add a color to it. So background color red. So you see that this element, of course, is way larger. And so then, by default, all other flex items grow as much as they can in order to have the same size. So you see they're perfectly aligned here at the bottom. Now, many times, this is exactly the behavior that we want. And before Flexbox, with just float layouts, this kind of layout was actually almost impossible to achieve with CSS alone. But now, as you see, it's very easy. It even happens by default, right? Now, in this situation, let's say we don't want that, and so let's fix it. So how do we fix it? Well, we simply set the align items property on the parent to something else. So on the flex container here, let's say align items and then set it to flex start. And yeah, so now it's back to only occupying vertically the space that is necessary without growing as much as it can. Great, that's amazing. So with this, we finished applying Flexbox to our project. And in this lecture in particular, we used almost all of the things that we had already learned about Flexbox. So that's amazing, and that's great progress if you're still sticking with me here at this point. And remember that Flexbox is a lot of stuff to take in, and personally, it took me a lot of time to actually learn all of it. So it's really not a problem if in your head things are still confusing at this point. All you need to do is to now start practicing Flexbox on your own. That is really key to make the material stick in your head. And the first opportunity for that is actually the coding challenge that is coming up in the next lecture. So hopefully I see you there as soon as you can.